Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Greg Cochran, and I am Managing Director for Pilko and Associates. Today, I am joined by Jeremy Venter. Jeremy is a lead advisor for Pilko and Associates, and today's subject for our Leadership Series video is post-acquisition value creation. Jeremy, before we get into the details, tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, it's good to be on the line with you. So yes, I'm Jeremy. I was born in South Africa, came over, did my PhD in chemical engineering at Penn State University, retired from my previous companies about 2 years ago, and then joined Pilko as a lead advisor. And I've been involved in many, a number of post-transaction projects as well as due diligence during acquisitions. So I look forward to talking to you about this topic.
So the specific topic today, and you and I have been on this subject for about a year and a half, I think, and done a lot of work here, but we're talking about post-acquisition. So the due diligence part that you talked about, that's done, right? So we've helped a buyer see clearly the value or the issues associated with the acquisition. Now we're talking about how to create value as you go forward. So I don't want to steal any further thunder from you. Why don't you talk about how do you begin that process? What is it like? And what you do.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, it is a very interesting topic. As you mentioned, we've been involved in a number of pre-acquisitions, and I think the post-acquisition work is not something that just happens at the end of a pre-acquisition effort. It actually starts during the pre-acquisition work. So what we found is when we do the pre-acquisition work, we have a fantastic opportunity to go into facilities, look at facilities, understand what the gaps are, get to know the players, understand what the issues are, get a flavor of what the culture is, what the leadership aspects are, so that by the time the pre-acquisition work is done, if we have to compete with others on post-acquisition projects, we have a wealth of information available to us. So the post-acquisition work is really focused on helping to identify those opportunities that companies can focus on to generate value post the acquisition. Because if you're an acquirer and you've just spent a lot of money buying at the EBITDA ratios that they want now, you've invested a lot of money and you want to get most value from that money afterwards.
So let me just interrupt real quick. I hear you clearly, but I just want to clarify something. We're not talking about synergy from an acquisition like that. You're talking about something other than synergy. Am I correct on that point?
That's absolutely true, Greg.
Okay.
You know, when the synergies are usually baked in the asking price and in the offer price, so they have a huge amount of money that they want to save and reduction in people or functions and so on. That's all taken care of. But they're looking for now trying to make the company valuable post-acquisition. Typically, companies that have been on the block for a while will be stripped of a lot of the resources that they might need for long-term success. So some of the functions might be funded in terms of people, maintenance, reliability, expenses may be below where they need to be. So in some ways, value has been stripped from the company. So the question becomes, how do you build a company that can sustainably generate value post-acquisition? And that is more than just reducing costs further. Oftentimes it is what value can you generate by adding perhaps additional people, by adding additional capability to utilize the assets that they have to a greater extent.
So when you are in the due diligence phase, just to clarify, when you're in the due diligence phase, you're actually making note or recognizing those kind of opportunities during due diligence in the likely event that post acquisition you can begin to help the client see those things more clearly, right?
Absolutely, Greg. And there's no time like during those visits to very quickly note down the opportunities that you have. So we work with our advisors. As you know, we have multiple advisors that visit facilities globally. So we try to standardize the input that they can provide. And part of that input is to identify strengths, weaknesses, liabilities, obviously, because the liabilities are important during the pre-acquisition phase, but then also look for opportunities. And those opportunities might be leverageable learnings that the company already knows in some places, but they have not employed at other places. So how do you leverage that information in order to generate more value globally? So absolutely. So not only doing that during the pre-acquisition phase, but also to document it immediately after the visit, because those are the things that are easy to forget. To keep track and tabs of those, so that by the time you get to the end of the first phase, during the pre-acquisition phase, that one has a nice list of opportunities that one thinks can be employed.
So I assume, and this is a question really, how do you measure value? There's got to be a way to do that, because you're looking at a lot of different, like you say, opportunities for improvement. You have to put a price tag on those things, I would assume. So how do you do that?
Great question, Greg. The process that one goes through is, once you have those opportunities identified, there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done post acquisition to reduce the number of items to a manageable number of opportunities or threads to pursue throughout the company. So that usually is the first phase of the work, is to the 50 or 100 opportunities that you have, boil that down, condense that to 10, 15 items that you think you can actually prioritize and put on top of what they're doing with additional resources. So once you have that, you can then, what we've done is we typically work with the client to try to understand, well, if we can do these things, what will it mean to you? And then benchmark that against industry averages. Things like injuries, for example, there's very, very good information available put out by CPC that actually goes through and says, this is how much you can save both in direct and indirect costs. Indirect costs being things like lower insurance premiums for each injury. So you can quantify the amount of value that can be generated by injury reduction, for example. Similarly, on the process safety front, you may have 10 process safety incidents, and you may be lucky 9 times out of 10 because the cost is low, but usually 1 out of 10, 1 out of 5 is a very large event that costs you millions of dollars.
Right.
So there's ways of averaging that out. So you end up with a value generation through cost deferral or cost avoidance through some of these. Things like OEE, operational efficiency, can go through and estimate based on industry benchmarks how much capacity you can get through focused efforts at the site level with local resources. And you can transfer that into a capacity or into additional revenue. And by doing that, we build a value model that has about 40 or 50 input variables that one can adjust and get an idea of not only what the cost would be to deploy the resources, but also the value per year that one can generate and can then, using hurdle rates, translate into a net present value, so that one can actually get a good feel for how much value you generate opposite the cost of those efforts.
Now, that sounds brilliant. Two things that you said as you were saying it, I was making a mental note of. One, this first one is like striking a nerve. You mentioned prioritization. That is critical, right? Because oftentimes in an event like this or in a transaction like this, everybody's got a very lengthy to-do list. So yeah, you don't want to just simply add to that list. You want to really force rank that and get the highest things first. And it sounds like the second point that you made is you actually can enable that prioritization process by very clearly articulating both costs, but also the sequential value of that. And now you really have a measuring stick that you can depend on to help you with that process.
That's very well put, Greg. And the one thing that I would add to that is usually when we engage in post-acquisition work, we find that the client, I don't want to say they're skeptical, but they're reserved in terms of their embracing of additional work, just because of the history, the pre-acquisition history, where costs have been stripped out of the organization. So they're reluctant to commit to additional work. But once that viewpoint that you just described, which is value and resources, once you bring those two together, people really engage, because I routinely find that the people in these companies want their companies to do better, want it to be successful, and they feel hamstrung because they haven't been able to deploy those resources. And once that conversation occurs and you build the trust, oftentimes they're very forthcoming on what needs to get done, what is needed, and that conversation between us and the client is really what generates the prioritized list, because they know they don't have infinite resources, right? And oftentimes they will tell you, and if I had 2 or 3 resources, I could really do this. And that's a great time to listen and incorporate those into the projects and value stream.
Super point. And I'm sitting here shaking my head and nodding my head simply because in my past history, I've been in both the acquired and the acquirer mode. And inevitably, we're talking about resources. And if you come alongside and say, look, here's the value proposition. When you add those resources, the additional horsepower you get out of that is this, and here's the value. So you mentioned a model. Is it really a model? Is it just a back of the envelope? Tell me a little bit more about your model, if you don't mind, because you also mentioned a bunch of variables that have to go into it.
Yeah, it's not, Greg. It's not super complicated, but it is basically a way of keeping track of assumptions that get negotiated between us and the client in order to come up with a value proposition that they can buy into. And it's very easy to do back of the envelope calculations that may be accurate. But then sitting down with a client and saying to them, we can save you $5 million a year. I mean, nobody is going to believe that number unless they actually open the hood and look at the engine a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that's what, when I say model, that's exactly what I mean. It's an iterative conversation around, okay, how many assets do you want to do OEE efforts on? Do you have 40 assets? Okay, let's do 5 a year, pace that out. How much do you think you can actually improve your utilization by annually, and for how long? You put that in. Okay, well, what is your capacity in those assets? I mean, that's the level of detail you get into, and all those things are assumptions. So it's built so that you can easily populate the assumption sheet with a variety of negotiated numbers. Mm-hmm. You put that in, and then it calculates behind the scenes. It calculates the value, and it gives you an NPV, and it gives you an annual curve that shows you how much money you save by a year, and it tells you what the upfront cost is. Because one other thing that we can talk about later is just resource modeling. Understand how much people and how much cost that would entail. But that's really the value. Is to try to understand, is this a $1 million savings, or is this a $10 million annual savings? And if that number is big enough, you move away from the conversation of, can you save us money, to how can we realize this value most quickly? And I think that's the conversation one wants to have, right? Is what's the value? And once you convince yourself through scenario analysis and through varying the assumptions, you can tell which programs are the ones that generate the most value very quickly. And you can focus on those, so that when we talk about prioritization, it's not just the resources, but it's also how much value do you generate per unit effort, for example. And you can do that doing this model, so that you end up with a well understood effort and priorities that you must hit in order to generate the value. And I didn't mention this earlier, but that framework then helps to define the deliverables for the post-acquisition work, right? You know how much value you want to generate, you know what programs you want to do, and you know the timeline. And that's really what you need as inputs for your project planning.
So two things come to mind as you were talking, Jeremy, the thoroughness of what you were talking about. One is, at a high level, I've got a business plan, a strategic business plan over the next 3 to 5 years. The details you just talked about sound as if they can connect and join up with a very detailed business plan. So whether I'm a commercial manager or an operations manager or a financial manager, it all goes in there. And so everybody's on the same page from a strategic planning perspective.
I think that's part of the value. Part of the benefit of having a value model is that by the time that conversation is complete, we know what we're shooting for. And to the extent they feel comfortable, and they're, what we define as value may not be exactly the same as what their internal auditors or finance groups would say. But that conversation can happen and can be translated into value that makes it onto a 5-year financial plan, for example. So that's exactly right. That's the goal, right? Is once you bake those numbers into their financial plans, I don't want to say they're obligated, but they're committed to delivering that value.
Yep.
And once they're committed and we've shared what we can do, we're committed to helping them get there. And I think that's a fantastic relationship.
Well, and that's the second point I wanted to raise. And you and I both in our histories have seen great business plans that die on the vine because there's no implementation
Right.
plan to actually go and do it, right? So did I hear you say deliverables and project charters and team? I mean, tell me about implementation of that plan, because usually that's where it dies.
So once you agree to the general threads that you want to pursue and you have a value assigned, so that helps you prioritize, you end up picking the ones that you really want to focus on. From those, we develop basically project charters. Those project charters would contain elements such as, what did we see in the facilities that make us think that this is actually a program we need to pursue? What is the objective? What is it that we want to achieve if we actually pursue this? If we pursue this, what is the plan, the high level plan with milestones? What do we want to do in the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, by the end of year one, where we want to be? And then we have a set of deliverables. We will give you this document. We will help you implement this program. You will lead this and we will assist, right? So it's not just everything we do, but also very clearly articulate what they're responsible for. And then based on that, come up with an anticipated resource need. We will deploy 3 people and you need to deploy 5. So you have the resources. All that is discussed up front before we start. And then they can decide if the company or the client can decide if they want to commit to it or not. So that's the high level project plan. Once you align on that, the next step is to actually develop a more detailed project plan. And that detailed is a bi-week project plan for as long as the project will run, 3 years, 5 years, 2 years. But then bi-week, put in the hours that we think Pilko people will have to be involved, and also what roles need to be present from the client. Do they need global resources? Do they need local resources? Do they need external resources beyond what they have? And map that out in time so that we have a very good idea of what the resource draw will be over the entirety of the project. So when there's multiple programs and you start overlapping them, that you can pace them so that the resource draw is fairly constant over the duration of the program, that you don't end up with peaks and valleys where you don't know what people need to do.
So you have a reality check, if you will, that this sounds great on paper, but what you're telling me is I've got to hire 50, a lot of people instantaneously, and that doesn't work, right? So I love the reality check of what you just said. This is a doable. And if there are, pinch points along the way, you see them, the client sees them, those can be smoothed out or adjusted because you understand that, right? You see that coming. So
it's actually very interesting. We built this resource model, and some of the negotiations we had, you fill in the numbers, but very quickly people want to see the visual representation of that, to actually see the graphs and the models, because intuitively that it jumps out at you where the gaps are. And then moving the programs, and of course, as you move the programs and the timing, that impacts the value. So you have to balance all this, right? You balance the resources, so the resource draw is constant, but then that usually means delaying some programs. That usually means you have to go to the value model and adjust it and make sure everything makes sense, but it also spreads out the cost. And what we typically find, Greg, is that the value generated far exceeds the cost of implementation. It's not unusual for the value to be 10 times what it is in terms of the cost of implementation. And that is the benefit of the scenario planning up front with a value model, because once you move people off of this is going to be close, I really need to count the pennies, and you get to the point where people understand, well, there's a lot of money on the table. It doesn't matter if I spend a little bit more or less, because the value is so big, it just outweighs everything else.
So if I'm on the board, C-suite, I'm at a level where I'm really focused on shareholder value, and I really want to understand our strategic plan here. All of this, I know I'm repeating myself, but all of this fits well within that, so that I'm not having to convince them of something new. I'm simply showing the adjustments to their existing plans and why that makes sense. Do I hear that correctly?
That's exactly right, Greg. I think to the extent that we can come alongside where companies are at, and help them achieve the goals that they already have
Mm.
by providing insights into how to do that, providing the expertise through our fantastic group of Pilko advisors, and show them the cost of that so that they can compare the cost and the value and with realistic plans. To the extent that we can do that through knowledge of the company and through the pre-acquisition work that we've done to try to understand the lay of the land, that we can go in and really articulate clearly what needs to be done. I think that is a fantastic way of coming alongside and helping them be successful. Because ultimately, if they're not successful, we're not successful, right? And if we get alongside them and work with them for them to be successful, that's a great win-win.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up or let you wrap it up. But, we're clearly, again, the subject that we're talking about is, post-acquisition value creation. And I love the word value there because usually the focus becomes, well, that's a cost, right? We see the cost side of things, but you take that off the table and you basically replace that with, no. Here's the value creation from your business performing in a better way and more efficient, more safe, etc. What are your closing thoughts, Jeremy? Do you have anything that you want to add to what you said already?
Greg, thank you for the time. Let me just close by just reiterating a few of the points we've made. This is a discussion on post-acquisition value creation, but you don't easily get to that unless you do the work, the homework, and the foundation laying in the pre-acquisition work. So I would just say it is really important during the pre-acquisition work to build relationships, to have an eye on what you could be doing in post-acquisition. Don't just focus on delivering the value in pre-acquisition, as important as that is. The greatest value generation happens post-acquisition. And to the extent that we can actually build the relationships and build the trust so that we can credibly put a case on the table for post-acquisition work, that's really where most of the value gets generated for both our client and for us. And I would end with that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Wisdom. I appreciate that very much. Jeremy Venter and post-acquisition value creation. If you'd like to know more about that, don't hesitate, please, to reach out to us at either www.pilko.com or call us immediately. We'd be happy to help. We hope that as you are managing your business, you're managing also to stay healthy and safe and COVID-free. We wish you all the best, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Greg.